Time to get started again, so we'll get right at it. I'd like to introduce Captain Gerry Davis, who is the Director of Security for Canada, Canada at ALPA International's Air Safety Organization. Gerry will moderate this panel on security screening of pilots, adopting a risk-based approach. Gerry, you have control.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bon matin, tout le monde. Honored guests, panel members, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's panel discussion and question period examining the security screening of pilots. I have served as a safety representative and security representative in Canada and worldwide for the last 28 years. We're addressing a subject here that is sensitive in nature. However, we will do it in a manner which will not compromise security or policies. I appreciate the presence of our panelists from both government and industry today who have agreed to participate, despite knowing that we approach this with a different viewpoint, even though we have the same goals overall. We all agree that pilots should be properly identified and employment with their airline confirmed in real time as the foundation for proper screening. Random physical screening is a standard recommended practice endorsed by our international partners and is a gatekeeper to the security network. I'd like to read to you from Transport Canada's Transportation Security Clearance Program website. The aim of Transportation Security Clearance Program policy is the prevention of unlawful acts of interference with civil aviation by granting clearances to persons who meet the standards set out in the program. Our restricted area identification cards, or RAIC passes. In all respects, ALPA wants Transport Canada and other stakeholders to support a risk and threat-based approach to national security, not a perception-based method. In other words, if it looks good, it's probably good. In the United States, ALPA has partnered with operators and the Transportation Security Administration to establish a known crew member program, which employs a more effective risk-based screening while retaining random physical screening methods. The practice of performing physical screening on pilots as the primary means of securing flight from whatever the perceived threat that airline pilots may pose is both antiquated and ineffective. This needs to change. Keep in mind that airline pilots represent less than 20% of commercial pilot population operating flights daily in Canada. Canada is slightly behind other countries, which have instituted a risk-based security measures that leverage what is known about an individual, their employment, and their identity to create a more effective security network. We believe that such a risk-based approach does and will prevent unauthorized persons from gaining access to our aircraft, which is the actual threat in this regard. One more brief comment before we begin the presentations, and it's regarding biometric screening and its effectiveness in clearly identifying an individual. Many things have been written about its veracity and ways of fooling the identification process. Most of these methods would require complicity by security representatives who monitor all access points and administer biometric screening procedures. Another layer in the onion skin approach to security. The predicted false identification rate forecast by biometric equipment manufacturers is numbered at 1 in 10 million for the possibility of a false positive identification of an individual. Considering that statistic, based on an average year of screening with just the pilots of a large regional carrier such as Jazz, with pilots numbering in the 1,000 range, we could theoretically have a false positive or misidentification of an individual in that group once every 111 years. Pilots want to be a part of the security solution, not a perceived threat. We are a valuable and little-used resource in security. We have already been identified as a low-risk threat to transportation security by virtue of our RAIC approval. RAIC and its administration and complexity are very costly, and there are other, more effective solutions to our security needs in Canada. I would now like to begin our security screening panel discussion with remarks and a short presentation from Ms. Brenda Hensler-Hobbs, Director General of Security, Transport Canada. Ms. Hobbs.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here today, and thank you for your opening comments as well. What I'd like to do today is take, I think, 10 minutes of your time to talk a little bit more broadly about Canada's aviation security program, about our risk-based approach that you referred to, a little bit about the insider threat, because we have seen changes to that threat in the last year, and it continues to be of concern to us. And then talk about the subject that you're discussing today, and that is non-passenger screening, our approach to non-passenger screening, and bring that home and talk a little bit more about the pilot role in that. So to start, as you may all be aware, and I apologize as I put my glasses on, you know, the principal approach and objective of our aviation security program is to mitigate the risks that are related to unlawful interference with civil aviation. So that is the basis for the National Civil Aviation Security Program in Canada. And what really drives us in terms of the standards that we need to meet in that program is, as you referred, international standards set by ICAO and recommended practices to mitigate these risks. As the lead department for aviation security in Canada, Transport Canada both develops the policies and the regulations for this regime, and also verifies compliance and obligations through our inspections and through our oversight. We do apply a risk-based approach to aviation security, and as you know, that aviation security regime involves passenger screening, screening of baggage, hold baggage that's in the plane, non-passenger screening, and air cargo. So it's quite a broad remit. In terms of our risk-based approach, Transport Canada realizes that it's absolutely impossible to eliminate all of the risk. Zero risk and 100% solutions do not exist. So we have to manage that risk. In order to manage that risk, we identify where mitigations or various actions can have the biggest difference, make the maximum difference. We have to maximize opportunities to actually prevent attacks, and we have to limit consequences should attacks occur. The risk-based approach that we apply and that the Canadian government applies includes a number of risk-based decision-making tools, such as a strategic risk assessment process. And your pilots are invited to and do participate actively in an annual process that we have to look at risk. Natural Resources Canada. Transport Canada produces an annual threat and risk assessment or context statement for aviation security in Canada, which is a scenario-based exercise, and the pilots and a number of pilots and pilot associations participate in that. It's really important to us that we understand the industry from various points of view, and to get that risk picture and understand what the risks are, the threats are, what mitigations are in place, and to understand if our regulatory structure actually addresses that risk appropriately. We need to have that conversation, not just once a year for that process, but ongoing conversation. And I feel we certainly, with the Pilot Association, with ALPA, and with other pilot associations, have an excellent relationship in that we do talk regularly and we do get feedback. In terms of the current risk, I'd like to talk a little bit about threats to aviation security, but drilling down very quickly. Insider risk, so the risk that's associated with individuals that have legitimate reasons to be in the restricted areas of airports, and that how it can be exploited is a real concern now. And you're all, I'm sure, aware of the potential or the the experiences or the events that we have seen in the last year, the Dallow explosion, for example, Sharm el-Sheikh, where there's certainly considerable information that suggests that it was an insider that actually facilitated the attacks in those two cases. So that is a concern, has always been a concern, certainly from an aviation security perspective, but a growing concern for both Canada and our international colleagues. Insiders or non-passengers can facilitate operational planning by providing both detailed information about security controls or by actually assisting in evading security controls, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. It's expected that we will see, because of the, although success of these types of attacks in the last year, we're going to, or we expect that we will see more of this. This is not going to go away. Certainly, governments, as I said, are focusing more and more on this issue. And it is just one piece, because there is baggage that we're concerned with. There are passengers that we're concerned with. It's all of these pieces and how they work together, but the insider threat is one that's not going away. And I'm sure we all know aviation remains a very viable target for terrorists and malicious actors. Insider attacks obviously can lead to the loss of life, also loss of public confidence in the aviation system, because it's a trusted individual that would facilitate such an attack. One that's subject to background checks, to security controls, et cetera. So a real concern to us. In terms of mitigating the insider risk, Canada has taken, I think, considerable steps recently, and when I say recently, the last 2 or 3 years, to strengthen its non-passenger screening program, to mitigate the security risk posed by non-passengers at Canadian airports. The program itself, as of this Sunday, 1st of May, will be a program that I think the enhanced program started in 2013, so 3 years in the making and in phases, an enhanced program that really is regarded around the world as one of the most rigorous and effective programs. Although we have, I think, because of the benefit we've had of working with our stakeholder partners, et cetera, we have managed to have a program that has a certain amount of randomness in it, which we're extremely fortunate to have done. That program, though, ensures that non-passengers are subject to CATSA screening prior to entering sterile and restricted areas. And as you know, subject to means that you will not enter a restricted area knowing that you will not be screened. There is always a chance that you will be screened as you enter a restricted area. There is a certain amount of randomness in that. It implements non-passenger screening and vehicle screening airside in a much more rigorous program than we have in the past airside, and also enhanced controls prior to entering sterile restricted areas within the air terminal building and the critical areas outside. Other security controls that mitigate the insider risk, though, and you referred to the RAIC card, certainly transportation security clearance checks, and those checks very much part of the issuance of a RAIC card, and enhancements to the RAIC requirements are also pieces that we've worked on together, I'd say, over the past number of years. You spoke specifically to the risk-based approach and how pilots fit into that approach. I very much appreciate your view that pilots and other crew are very much members of a team that contribute to the safety and security of the aircraft and of the air system broadly. Our program does involve screening of non-passengers, including air crew, as you know, to mitigate that full range of risks. Our transportation security program and our RAIC program, so both of those pieces, as you said, the biometric piece, the card itself, and the transportation security clearance and that rigorous process that supports those are a very important part of our layered approach. And that allows us to have a more random approach to non-passenger screening. As you know, a number of jurisdictions and most jurisdictions around the world have 100% screening of all non-passengers, including flight crew and pilots. Canada has been able to, and as you say, our US colleagues as well, have been able to go to the international table and say, no, we have an approach that meets that same need because it's a layered approach, because we have transportation security clearances, we have biometrics, so we can apply a certain randomness to it, which really does allow us to have a more efficient program. Pilots in uniform as well are permitted now to use Nexus lines, so lines for expedited screening at Class 1 airports. These lines do allow persons to pass through screening checkpoints by saving some time, because you can leave belts, light outerwear, etc. on, headwear on, as you go through screening. And we're also looking at expanding that expedited process to other places at Canadian airports for international, domestic to international, and also some domestic to domestic checkpoints. I have to say, in working with this regime, ALPA has taken a leadership role, has participated in consultations on our non-passenger screening working group, which was active for over 2.5 years, has provided valuable feedback on the non-passenger screening enhancements that we have put in place, and also really lead by example every day, because there is excellent collaboration between pilots and CATSA, who's doing the actual screening, in the day-to-day operation of airports. I'd like to leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to save our question period for the end, but right now I'd like to introduce to you Monsieur Benoit Legault, Manager of Training and Quality Assurance of the Canadian Air Transportation Security Authority.
Thank you, Gerry. Good morning, everyone. I'd first like to thank ALPA and the organizers for inviting me to take part in this discussion. It should be very interesting. So I've prepared a few slides that we can go through fairly quickly here in preparation for as a primer for the discussion. So I wanted to, a lot of you are probably familiar with CATSA, but I wanted to briefly go through our history, mandate, governance, just to contextualize the organization, the service delivery model, to make sure that we're all on the same page. Then, based on discussions I had with Kevin and with Gerry, realized that the restricted area identity card was probably going to be a topic of interest, and as well the experience at screening for aircrew and pilots. So I'm going to be talking about that as well. So CATSA was created, as most of you know, in 2002 following the events of 9/11. The purpose initially and still is to oversee and strengthen aviation security in Canada. We're a Crown corporation. We are owned and funded by the federal government, and we have 4 major responsibilities: pre-board screening, hold baggage screening, non-passenger screening, which we've just heard about, and the restricted area identity card. Essentially, we work with screening contractors to deliver the services, so we use a third-party contractor model. We work closely with Transport Canada, with Brenda and her colleagues in order to operationalize the regulations. We have a board of directors who report into the Minister of Transport and into Parliament. Just a few numbers here. There are 89 airports in Canada designated for security screening. As you know, Canada is a large country, so there's a lot there's a need for a lot of planning and coordination, and this is one of our key roles. Last year we screened 57.3 million passengers. We have well over 6,000 screening officers that work through our screening contractors. And briefly here, and I don't know if you can see well on the map, but there are 4 colors. So this is just to illustrate how we actually work with our contractors. We have 4 administrative areas geographically in Canada. We have the Pacific region, the Prairies, Central, and Eastern, and our service delivery contracts are split into those 4 regions. So we essentially have 4 contracts in place to deliver screening at all of Canada's airports. So a quick sort of overview of the restricted area identity card program and our responsibilities and our partners' responsibilities, because we also share those responsibilities with Transport Canada and with the airport authorities. So the RAIC program is a regulated requirement. Workers inside the restricted area need to be to hold a RAIC, as it's called, since January 2007, and the idea was to also at that time make sure that we had a robust biometric system to validate the credentials. Essentially, Canadian air transport workers, the system is maintained by CATSA. It is designed by CATSA as well, but we work in partnership with the airport authorities, as I've mentioned. RAIC is an important component of the Canadian air transport security system. It adds security value through the vetting process, clearly. That's a very important piece for all of the folks and all the people that work in the airports that need access to the restricted areas. It also, the RAIC system per se, and the way that we use it to validate the information is very important to validate that those credentials are indeed valid. And it allows us to prevent fraudulent use of those credentials as well. The vetting process is taken into consideration, and I think this is something that Brenda has already alluded to, when it comes to the screening regime. So it is a risk-based approach that is being applied. That's important to remember. And RAIC is not meant to replace screening. So that's another piece that's important. While we need to be able to make sure that the folks that need those accesses have been vetted, we still need to apply the screening process to them. And finally, RAIC is not access control. It does work in conjunction with the access control processes and procedures that are in place at the airports, but the main objective here is to validate those credentials in real time. I'm going to go through this quickly. So as I've mentioned, there are three key stakeholders. There's Transport Canada, obviously the regulatory body. They receive the applications for the clearances and also share the results with the airports when those results are available. CATSA designs, develops, and delivers the RAIC system. We supply and maintain the readers, handheld readers, or whether they be wall-mounted. We manage the database and provide support as well to the airports and various stakeholders. And the airport authority plays a really important role by being the credential issuing authority. So this is something that they are responsible for. It's their authority. The access control policies, the procedures, the system management is also theirs. And they also will work closely with CATSA to do some maintenance in some cases. So there are 4 steps. This is just a quick overview, and I realize it's probably too small for you to read on the slides, but I'll just go over it briefly. There are 4 steps prior to an individual having access or hoping to get access to the secure areas before they can actually use a RAIC. So the first step, they need to apply through the airport for security clearance. So that process is handled through Transport Canada. Then once this is completed, there's an approval that's been granted. There's a capture of the fingerprint, the iris scan. All this information is then linked to a database. The information is printed, encoded into the card, and then so that the actual card contains all of the information needed to validate the credentials. Then the information is also added into the local access control systems. And then at that point, once all of these steps have been covered and the individual has received the RAIC, then they can start using it, and then we can validate in real time against the database for security clearance as well. So I think that's an important piece. Is we're not talking about a link to a static database. The card, every time that it's being scanned through, we're able to tell whether this clearance is still valid or not. So a couple of more slides, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague. I wanted to talk a little bit about the screening experience. And obviously, I know that this is something that's of high importance and something that we hear a lot of comments about. Obviously, in your line of work, you will be going through screening a lot of times, sometimes multiple times a day. So we know that that's something that affects you. So again, in my discussions with Gerry and Kevin, I wanted to be able to, just to sort of prime the conversation, talk about the things that we're doing at CATSA and that you're doing as well and that you can be doing to improve that screening experience. I mean, none of this is going to be groundbreaking, but I think it's nice and it's important to restate the importance of these things. Obviously, our primary mandate is security. So this is something that we're first and foremost concerned about. Our screening officers, they're there to perform this duty, and they're trained on our procedures, and their role is really to apply those procedures consistently. We also understand that your community, so air crew, air pilots, and others at the airport, they play a vital role in this environment, and they need to be able to make their way to the areas that they need to access in order to do their work. We also understand that in this role, and I think I've already mentioned this, it can be, it's something that you might need to go through several times a day, or at least several times a week, and it can be frustrating to always be subjected to the same thing. So we understand that. Also, another point I think that's important to talk about is the consistency. So with 89 airports across the country, there can be some variations. I mean, sometimes we're talking about different equipment that's being installed or that's being used in different airports. We also have some local procedures that might be slightly different depending on the amount of access points and their setups. We also have 6,000 plus screening officers that work with us. There can be some variation sometimes in applying the procedures. We try and eliminate those. We ask everybody to be consistent, but large country, large operations, it will occur sometimes. We also really insist a lot in their training programs, whether it be the initial training and the recurrent training programs, on customer service and customer experience. Again, even more important in the case of non-passenger screening, we know you have a job to do, you need to get through. We want to make sure that we provide a courteous and speedy experience. When there are issues, it will happen sometimes. Again, we have a lot of screening officers. I think that generally speaking, we provide a very good level of service. We do our best. It will happen that sometimes we misstep, or we may not be able to provide the experience that we would like to provide. In those cases, we do have ways to address, and we're very interested in knowing about these situations so that we can improve. So there's different mechanisms. Myself, for example, I'm in regular contact with Kevin, so with ALPA and also with other associations. I'm responsible for procedures, I'm responsible for training, so I'd really like to know when we have issues that we need to resolve, because I get on them and I'm interested in making that better. From the perspective of aircrew and pilots, again, none of this is going to be earth-shattering news to you, but I think that it's very important when you get to the checkpoint, in order to ensure that speedy process, that be prepared. And obviously, having to go through the screening checkpoints regularly, I would be quite certain that you know what to expect and how to get ready. The vast majority of air crew and pilots that come through our checkpoints regularly on a daily basis, I think that the experience is really good. The exchanges and the relationship is really good. It does happen sometimes that frustration may be part of the equation, and the temptation to challenge screening officers and really ask, okay, so why do I need to do this? What's the point of this procedure? And I can understand why, but what I would ask is that really, in order to have a good screening experience and to speed things up, raise those issues through the proper channels. When you see an inconsistency, and as I said, we do our best, but it may happen that we don't apply a procedure in a specific location exactly the way that we should, or a little bit differently. Raise these issues through your associations, or even if you want to speak to a supervisor at the line. But I don't think it's in anybody's interest to confront a screening officer and then just try to get them to provide answers that they don't have the answer to. They also don't have the flexibility from an operational standpoint, from a procedural standpoint, to make exceptions. So that's very important. And then I think in the end, I'd like to say that it's about respecting each other's responsibilities. You have a very important job to do. Screening officers do as well. And again, as I said, I realize that I hear very few either complaints or issues on our side from frustration, but I know it does happen. So largely speaking, I don't think that's a problem, but when it is, I would ask you to raise these through the proper channels. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Benoit. Once again, just to remind you, we're going to hold our questions until afterward. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to hear now from Chris Phelan, Senior Director of Security and Industrial Affairs with the Canadian Airports Council. Chris, good morning.
Thanks, Gerry, and thank you to ALPA for inviting me here today. I just wanted to speak briefly. This is a subject that brings up a lot of passions, I know, so I want to keep my comments brief and limited to the role of airports in screening. So first off, airports really have two main functions in connection with screening, and that's of passengers and non-passengers. That's providing CATSA with the space and facilities to conduct screening, and that's PBS, NPS, and HBS. As well, presenting those passengers and non-passengers that are required to be screened to CATSA. That's closing the doors, that's directing traffic, that's all that we've seen over the past 3 years coming into force, making sure that this new program works effectively and can't be circumvented. So under those two pieces of legislation and regulation, they govern our activities. At RAIC at airport, RAIC from our perspective is the backbone of the airport security system. The value of knowing that the person presenting themselves to be screened or at a door is in fact the person that owns the card, and that there's no known knowledge of that person having any ill intent to threaten civil aviation is enormous. It's a great value. It's a great partnership between Airports Transport Canada and CATSA. So we are fully behind the program. However, we note that the program is getting a little old. I think just the data, the software, all these things could use a refresh. We were talking with CATSA 2 weeks ago in Winnipeg, and we've come up with the idea of having a RAIC working group run out of the CAC to look at our vision of what the RAIC program could be for the next decade. And we will work with CATSA to improve those processes that don't require regulatory changes, that some of the customer service elements, whose responsibility is what, and how can we harmonize or streamline those, and then work with Brenda and her team to amend any regulation that can be amended to make the program faster, smarter, better. So this will be coming out over the next year or so, so I look forward to working with them. Benoit didn't, in terms of it taking too long, Benoit didn't mention it, and costing too much. CATSA buys 80,000 RAIC cards a year. There are 110,000 RAIC holders in the country. People are switching out their RAICs frequently, and that's time for CATSA and cost for CATSA. That's time for airports and costs for airports. So we need to look at how it's done so that we can make it faster and smoother. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the screening of pilots. As Brenda said, ICAO sets the standard. Transport Canada interprets the standard. Airports have no role in who and how passengers or non-passengers are screened. We provide the space and make sure they are presented. Transport Canada conducts the risk assessments. We've gone over them over the past several years about who should be screened and at what level, and they are satisfied with their list, and that's how we operate and how CATSA operates going forward. I am aware that there was some work done on an exemption policy framework. I don't know where the status of that is, but certainly I think that's an opportunity for pilots to examine their possibilities there. I would suggest that it's a rigorous process because Brenda is not exempt from screening, so I would think the first person to go through that would be her, so good luck.
Thanks very much, Chris. Some interesting statements about RAIC, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Thank you. Now we'd like to hear from Peter Herron, who's the Manager of Corporate Security for Jazz Airlines.
Thank you very much, Gerry, and thank you, the ALPA members, for inviting me today. The NPS conversation is kind of a beast to speak about. If you get the experts in the room to discuss NPS, we could be there for hours and the debate would be quite lively. But because of what Gerry alluded to earlier, there's some security sensitive information, so I'll be limited on what I can say. And for those that do know me, you'll be happy to know that I'll be brief as well. I feel it's important that we go do a little bit of history. And if we look back in the good old days, we lived in an environment that we had regulations that were safe, secure. They met the needs of what was happening in the world and the state that we were operating in. If you remember, we were all issued hard keys at one time. We would go look at the keypad on the door. If you forgot the keypad on the door, you would look up and see where it was written from the last person who forgot it and then remembered it. At that time, while industry was engaged with transport, we pretty much let transport do their own thing, let them prescribe the regulations, and there really wasn't a lot going on at that time. They were more checking out our compliance rather than putting together new programs. No one knew that, and I don't like to use this term, but it's relevant here, no one knew that the horrific events that were going to happen in 9/11. Our world's changed then. Well, the events occurred wholly within the United States and on American flag carriers. Immediately, the security regulations came at the carriers very fast, very hard, and there was no room or opportunity to have a consultation or a consultative process with the government. We were issued these emergency amendments, or EAs, very quickly and rapidly, and a lot of times they were saying to us that you must implement within 10 hours, within 12 hours, and they usually came out on a Friday afternoon, and it would just set your world in a titter, and your weekends were gone. That being said, a lot of the EAs are only issued to the carrier because we're the ones that were operating into U.S. territory. However, the language in those emergency amendments had regulations or prescriptions that affected Transport Canada, the airport authorities, the screeners, anybody whose step was in the footprint of a terminal building. It was very frustrating for us because we were told that we couldn't share them because they were issued to us only. Carriers had to explain then to the government what we needed from the other players so that they could implement their own security directives. At that time, industry developed a very strong relationship with Transport Canada. We all had very open dialogue. We were free to speak, we were free to critique and provide language to transport that would help ease these regulations for everybody involved. It was unusual that back in the old days, we would never have had access to the Director General. It would be like we would consider it having an audience. So, but now Brenda now the relationship is so strong that we can pick up the phone and we talk and then we consult, and that is fantastic for industry and the regulator. The process was working so well that we brought in all the other stakeholders that were having to deal with these regulations. We brought in the labor unions, we brought in the screening companies, airport authorities, foreign carriers, anybody who wanted to sit down and help develop and make these regulations as easy as possible. Since that time, while this process was evolving, we went through some pretty significant experiences, like the restrictions on legs, the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, and it was still coming out as hard and heavy from the US or from other countries, but we had built this relationship with transport and all the stakeholders that it went a lot smoother and we were able to move forward quickly. So where are we today? Well, the threat still remains. Public safety and security are still the top priority for everybody. I feel the first thing we need to do is maybe look at benchmarking to some other countries, see what they're doing, and look at some of our technologies, where the threats are really coming from. And I know we keep using the term risk-based approach, and that's where we should be heading. We need to look at our random screening, how we do random screening, because I really don't think it works. Leaving Halifax today, you step on, you all know you step on a mat, you get the arrow. I really do not feel it was justice today to see an elderly passenger who maybe travels once a year have to go through an image detection and add the stress. We got to be looking deeper at our travel patterns of who is actually traveling and start like perhaps at the time of bookings. If we look at the Israeli model, and I know ALPA went to Ben Gurion Airport a few years ago, that was brilliant. That was a good step, and transport was along as well. NPS, the beast, that's an international standard that's really not going to go away. We're really going to look at a more robust system, and again, based on risk-based threats. And part of the good thing is if we look at the Nexus program, how we help put throughput through for our recognized trusted travelers, maybe we can expand on that Nexus program over into for flight crew members or for anybody who works in that air environment. We already have the infrastructure, so if we're going to start talking about this, let's not reinvent the wheel. And most importantly for me is let's not put the cost back on the carrier. So we seem to get that a lot. I emphasize with the ALPA members who are traveling through 8 or 9 cities a day and are seeing the inconsistencies. I know that I hear their frustration daily via emails, and I try to reach out to CATSA as much as possible and ask what is happening here, and is there a certain threat that's happening in that terminal today, or what's going on? So I think it's important, that we all work together, have these conversations, look at what we have, what we can get rid of, where we can benchmark, and hopefully at the end of the day we'll have a better system. I know it's frustrating for you guys. I hear reports that going through NPS that I was told to eat my jelly donut because it's considered a leg. So I don't know if we started measuring trans fats, but you know, it's improving, but I think there's a lot more improvement that we could be doing. So I just thank you for the opportunity, and for industry, we're willing to help as much as we can. Thanks.
I was going to ask the question about whether or not we should do away with RAIC altogether and just screen people, but I'm hearing a very solid line here of we need RAIC. We just need to administrate it a little bit differently. Chris's comment about improving the RAIC system as it is right now, and I did see a panel earlier where somebody talked about a lot of money sitting somewhere within our government coffers that's not being utilized right now for any other purpose in its 300 million or something I heard earlier. So I do want to start with questions, and I would like to say, in talking about RAIC, what's the probability here? It's a very expensive program. What's the probability from any one of you that the RAIC program is actually going to be expanded to general aviation? Because as I talked about earlier, airline pilots are only 20% of this, of the daily pilot population that's operating in this country in a day. What are the chances that we're going to expand this to general aviation, class 1, 2, or 3 airports in Canada? Anybody?
Well, I can certainly speak to that from a regulatory perspective. At this time, there's no intent to expand RAIC to general aviation. The approach, certainly the Canadian approach, as I said, to aviation security is a risk-based approach, and at this time, the assessment being that that risk is really focused on the part of the aviation system that we're dealing with now. So.
The part that involves mostly the public,
Commercial.
most of the public.
Yes, exactly.
I see, yeah. Just curious, has a risk assessment ever been done by Transport Canada on pilots as a group?
I guess that's me again.
I'm just wondering, I'm sorry, it is you again, but when you're talking about that, it just...
I mean, we do, as we said earlier, we do a national threat and risk assessment every year. We also look at, certainly for non-passenger screening, risks associated with various populations for the purpose of assessing if there's a requirement for exemptions in certain cases. And as you know, we do have extremely limited exemptions in all of our regulatory regime, and the stakeholders that we regulate, airports, air carriers, are able to apply for exemptions. So in order to support our exemption process, we do look every 2 or 3 years at the broader non-passenger screening population to ask ourselves, do we have it right? Because we do have extremely limited exemptions for individuals, and I'm not even generalizing here, that are either providing in the course of their duty a law enforcement function or are emergency management folks that are responding to an emergency. Extremely limited exemption from the screening of non-passengers. But we do have to, on a regular basis, ask ourselves, is that right? Are there other populations we need to include? Because by virtue of the fact we're screening them, we are enabling them in some way to do the job they need to do in a timely manner. So it's extremely limited. So we do undergo that process, because if we don't, I mean, we can't say, yes, we've set that bar once and we're never changing it. So we do every 2 or 3 years. Is it specifically about pilots? No.
If anyone wants to chime in here with a question, please, by all means.
Always.
Thank you, Mark.
Good morning, Brenda. This question is for Transport Canada. I'm Mark, pilot with Air Transat. And you actually kind of started to talk about the subject. So here's one of my questions. How come me, as an airline pilot, which I'm ultimately responsible for the safety and security of my airplane and passenger, have to go through NPS and be treated like any other regular user, considering the function I'm doing for Canadian Aviation? While I have a custom agent walking right beside me, not even touching the mat, and going through because he's identified with his RAIC. Why can he go through? He's no risk, but me, I'm a risk. if I'm a risk, maybe we shouldn't have Canadian Aviation. I'm responsible for the safety of my passenger, no one else.
Yeah. It's an extremely important question, and one to understand, I think, beyond the side that you explain, which is that we have, and Canadians have, extreme trust in pilots because you are the folks keeping those passengers safe and secure. You're absolutely right. But the idea with the non-passenger screening program is that we are going to screen the broad range of employees at airports and not create a part of that population that could be vulnerable to exploitation. So it's not just about a pilot or an individual having the malicious intent. It's about once you take that non-passenger screening population, and specifically those folks that are on the airplane, controlling the airplane, or in some way have access to that airplane from a mechanical, whatever perspective, once you take a part of that population and say, we guarantee you will never be screened, then our risk-based approach starts falling apart.
That's what you're doing with custom agents, and they still have access to my airplane.
With customs agents that are performing their duty as a representative of the Government of Canada in the airport and need to do that in a timely manner.
I need to get to work in a timely manner as well.
That's
and
right,
as
and
of
we-
Canadian air regulation, an airline pilot is also a peace officer on board this airplane.
So by creating a population that has access, direct access to the airplane, that
We're
could
already
be
at one.
exploited by a malicious actor, either knowingly or unknowingly, is something that is just too high a risk for us. And it's not just pilots, it's any large group of folks in that world.
We can go back and forth on this
We'll-
quite a
we'll-
bit.
we'll chat after.
One of the things that I was recently at a meeting in the United States, and one of the former directors of counterterrorism in the United States, one of the things that he said to me was, anybody can be bought. It raised an interesting perspective because, as Hensler-Hobbs said, if you give everyone a free pass, or if you give a group a free pass, we no longer have a risk-based question about it.
I have an answer for that, but
Yes,
I'll
I
delve
understand.
it to you in private.
I understand where you're coming from, and
Yeah.
thank you very much for your question. Captain DePete.
I guess I have to follow up to that one. Okay. First of all, hey, I want to thank everybody here. I'm the National Safety Coordinator and First Vice President for the Airline Pilots Association. What a fantastic panel. And it's just absolutely outstanding, all the guests we have here today. Just amazing what can happen when you get everybody in one room and you get to exchange these ideas, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's what ALPA loves doing, and I think we do it pretty well. I wanted to ask you a question, because I'm a member of the Aviation Security Advisory Committee. I'm very interested, obviously, help Captain Knoll oversee all the security issues in our union. So I want to talk about KCM for just a second. We know KCM is ICAO compliant. It's one of our high priority issues to expand the use of KCM, known crew member, to our fellow pilots in Canada. So just statistically, I just wanted to say that there are, and I want to get this in before the elections in the United States and you build the wall, so I want to get that in there really quick. And I'll help you lay the first brick, actually. Up to now, since inception, 50 million screenings. That's quite an amazing statistic there. That's about 376 or 378,000 screenings per week. Tremendous amount of benefit for our pilots, but also for our carriers, because it's really increased the throughput at the airports and focused security in a risk-based way to the people we don't know, right? The folks that we don't know. So I was kind of curious if you could tell me what the feeling is with Transport Canada and CATSA on the issue. And I know we're pushing it from our end, and I was just kind of curious if you can kind of give me some of your thoughts on that. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. Well, thank you for your question. And Known Crew Member Program obviously is a program that we're very familiar with. And I think there's two elements, or perhaps, and your question is just one of them, but there's two elements to that. And the first is, or the first question I think is, what are the government's views in terms of Canadian air carriers being part of the US Known Crew Member Program? And certainly we've had that discussion with A4A, with others. And the Canadian government certainly supports, should an air carrier wish to be involved in the U.S. known crew member program, and the U.S. government approve that, certainly we would support that in the U.S. environment. The other question, of course, is the other side of that. Is the Canadian government prepared to, or preparing to have a known crew member program in Canada? And we've talked about that a little bit with Mark's question in terms of, are we looking at exempting from screening a certain portion of the population? The answer, no. But I think part of that, and part of understanding that, and I think your comments, Gerry, related to this at the beginning as well, is that you do, when you have these conversations about these types of programs, you start getting into comparing regimes and saying, why don't we do the same thing as the US? Why don't we do the same thing as Europe? I think it's really important to understand that you've got an aviation security regime that's quite broad. It's comprised, as we talked about, passenger, non-passenger screening, et cetera. So it's got all these pieces that work together in a certain manner. For each part of that screening, there's no magical equation. So there's nothing that, when ICAO sets a standard, it doesn't say you will do exactly this. It's you'll achieve this objective. And when you look at non-passenger screening, we and the US and other jurisdictions say this is how we're going to achieve the objective. And it's not about screening a passenger or screening a non-passenger or just applying K9 or just applying a transportation security clearance. It's about a combination of those and international mutual recognition that what you're doing in your risk environment is equal to others, not identical to. So we all have different ways of getting to that equation that's going to be accepted internationally or accepted bilaterally in the case of the Canada-US. And without going into any great details, some of what's in that equation is very visible. It's screening, it's transportation security clearances. Others is less visible. And it's that whole package of measures that comprise non-passenger screening for our different jurisdictions that add up to something that we are comfortable with in terms of aviation security, and we can convince our colleagues bilaterally, internationally, is appropriate for the global aviation security regime.
Thank you.
I think it's important to also keep in mind that we currently do have a trusted traveler program in Canada, and that air pilots, air crew are already considered to be part of that group. So I would say that we already take into consideration the fact that the risk is lower. And I would like to also add maybe to Mark's question earlier, when we're talking about the way that the screening process is approached at non-passenger screening, we hold our own screening officers to the same standard. They also need to be screened before they show up to work. So I think that really broad sort of view right now that's being taken is really applied across the board, mostly, with maybe a few exceptions. So I think it's important to realize that. I mean, obviously, you're a screening officer. You're very familiar with the process. Why should you go through the screening? But we think it's important as well.
Thank you both. Before we just move on to the next question, Brian, if you would, just curious, Peter, how much difficulty does the non-passenger screening point add to the day for an operator? What sort of issues do you find that come up as an operator that are, what's the barriers to your day?
Well, I know that we've had a few occasions where there's been something that has happened at the MPS, and I'm really not going to go into great details on it, but it creates a lot of frustration for that flight crew member that they want to take a moment to maybe just debrief with their supervisor. Sometimes it's giving me a phone call, and sometimes there's an operational impact where you could take a delay because that person just wants to collect themselves. There has been some times where there has been some altercations at pre-boarding, and we do preach that please listen to the screener, do what you're told, file a report so we can go back to CATSA to get rid of some of these things. The biggest issue that impacts our operation is the inconsistency across the airports. Okay. And we really need some more guidance, especially when we come to, we have the who can, when use NPS screening. If you're a commuter, if you're deadheading, what's the lag restrictions? Are there lag restrictions? We really need some more in-depth material from transport so it would alleviate some of the frustrations for crew members.
Thank you, Peter. Chris, from an airport's perspective, you have to meet the minimum standard for Transport Canada, for the regulator. And yet the various airports, administering to their own security needs, which is part of the regulation, do things differently which cause some impediments to air crews transiting non-passenger screening points. One airport, for instance, you can use your RAIC card to access the ramp. Another airport, your RAIC card has to be identified, and an administrative process has to be undertaken in order to approve the card. And another airport, they look at your picture and you walk through. Why is that? What is the crux of that issue, that there's differences between the airports that are dealt with?
Well, airports don't just meet the minimum requirements as set
that's
out.
the minimum.
So,
yeah.
so there isn't, there aren't A, B, C's in the regulations. Everyone meets the standard, is fully compliant, and then given their own particular environment, may add additional layers, or, I'm sure it's awkward or uncomfortable at times for the pilots transiting through those airports, but those are built in to add an additional security layer for the airport, for their own sense of security and their own airport security program. So I can see that there would be inconsistency, but it is only their intent to maintain a high degree of security.
I understand that. In that respect, and since we're talking about risk-based, in the case of individual airports requiring different things, are they based on science? Are they based on risk assessments? Or are they based on something else that the airport authority comes up with? In other words, at an individual airport, let's pick Rubber Boot, Saskatchewan. If they in fact say, we need to do an extra screening on people's luggage for whatever reason, how do they come up with that issue? How does that individual airport, do they do actually an internal risk assessment to determine that they need that particular step?
Well, intelligence comes from our regulator. So if the regulator has flagged an issue, then it's incumbent on the airport to address it. Airports under a separate set of regulations, the amendments to the KSARs, had to conduct their own threat and risk environments and take steps to mitigate threats as appropriate to make sure that their airports are operating in a safe and secure environment. So that could be it. I can't speak to what the individual airports base their decision on. I'm not privy to that. Largely it would be between the individual airport and the regulator.
Thank you, Peter. You have a question, sir?
Brian Shuri, ALPA Canada. It's a couple quick questions. The first one's for Chris. I was really interested when you mentioned this RAIC working group, and you mentioned CATSA and the airports. Is there an intention to include the other stakeholders in the process? Obviously, we would have a very keen interest in participating in that process. That's the first question. I'm just going to run into the second question as well, just in the interest of saving some time. And it's kind of picking up on Peter's point a little bit. We have had some operational difficulties when a RAIC is seized at an NPS checkpoint. And we talked about frustration, and I'm not going to tell any war stories or anything like that, but suffice it to say there is a lot of frustration that comes up occasionally at the checkpoints. And in the unfortunate circumstance when a RAIC is seized at the checkpoint, there is not a clear established process to return the RAIC. It's sort of individual within the airport authorities. So either Chris, Brenda, if you guys could weigh in on that one as well. I'd be curious to hear your comments, how we might be able to expedite that process, find maybe a more transparent process, because it's certainly in our interest, our members' interest, and the operators' interest as well.
Sure, and your first question, the working group, it's not particularly mature yet. This is, the idea came up 2 weeks ago. I think given if there's interest, we would certainly want to get the carriers, and clearly there's interest in ALPA. It depends where we're going with it and how much work and energy, time, effort we have to put into it. But certainly open to it, so please give me your contact and I'll take it to my group, because it does make sense that if there's industry-wide consensus that we can take forward to government that benefits everyone, it's all the better. And then RAIC return procedures. I'm afraid I don't operate an airport and I don't know, but I do believe that it is an individual airport procedure, and how and who you give it to deactivate it, or what it is and what the penalties are in case there's been a violation, entirely airport by airport.
If I may, I believe there's a process installed within the government program that has an individual who appoints 2 other members to a council. When a RAIC is removed, they have to justify why it's removed. There's an interview process, et cetera, for Brian's purposes. And then the individual who's in charge of that ends up having a council, if you will, self-appointed council, to determine whether or not the individual will have his RAIC returned.
You're absolutely right, Gerry. In the case of a suspended transportation security clearance, as a result, a RAIC can be pulled. And in those cases, if a RAIC is suspended, then there is a process for an advisory board to consider the situation and if the transportation security clearance would be renewed or given back to the person or not, and then the RAIC would follow that for that. Yes, absolutely.
And I could maybe just add that from CATSA's perspective, that is one of the reasons why when your members go through the screening process, that we hang on to the card. Should there be a security incident or whatnot, then this is where we actually play the part of keeping that RAIC and then working with the airport so they can make the decision as to what's going to occur.
Yes, go ahead.
If I could, I wanted to go back actually one subject before, only because we talked a little bit and someone had asked the question about, that was twofold, part about consistencies in screening, the other piece, well, I'll talk to consistencies first. I think the one thing I'd really be interested in terms of both consistencies of screening, but also in terms of the impact, as you asked, Peter, the impact of non-passenger screening on operations and air carrier operations. These are 2 things that have been brought up to us in the past and that I have great interest in. From the impact perspective, it's something that we, as we look at our programs, we really have to understand. We want to do things as efficiently as possible, and we have to understand if we're not being efficient, what impact are we having on industry, and how can we then mitigate that? So extremely important, and I'd look to air carriers and Peter, yourself, and others to say, you know, we are seeing delays because of screening, or we are, and this is what it looks like, and this is what it means to us from an economic or an operational perspective. It's an extremely important discussion to have and something we need to hear, because when we started enhancing our non-passenger screening program, the view was certainly given to me from the pilot population that this was going to slow us down, it's going to impact our availability to do things on time, et cetera. And that's a very valid thing for us to be thinking about, but we need data so that we can really understand that issue and work with CATSA to how do we mitigate it. On the issue of consistency, I've said this before, certainly to individuals in your group that I talk to regularly, but I'll say it to you as well. I think pilots and crew are in this absolute unique situation, more than myself, my inspectors, CATSA, management to see how we apply screening across the country, and where it's not consistent to bring it to our attention. Because, you know, our inspectors are regional, CATSA management is regional. We don't every day fly to different. So the input from pilots and aircrew on here's the inconsistencies we see, and to question those is extremely important. And I want to just, you know, emphasize that. It's a really important piece to the puzzle for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
My question is with yourself from Transport Canada, CATSA, CAC, the importance of RAICs and implementing the screening process. My question is, if it's such a national-wide, when you apply to get a RAIC, you have to go through Transport Canada, security background clearance, et cetera, why is it left to individual airports for the issuance of the RAIC? And I think that may play into why you see such widely different and varying inconsistencies throughout the NPS.
I have to say, and I have to admit, I'm not familiar with what the rationale originally was for that, but certainly from a very, I think, logistics perspective, I think it was the way of managing. I mean, we have to have an airport identify to us, to the federal government, this is an individual that has the requirement to access the restricted area. So that's the first part. The other, which is the actual issuance, like the management of the RAIC card itself, from a very practical perspective, in my view, needs to be with the airport. But my colleagues here have all been here longer than me, and they might know what the rationale was for that. I do apologize.
I think really it rests with the responsibility at the airport level of access control itself. Yeah. So that access control is something that they are in charge of. And in my mind, and I'm a little bit the same as Brenda here, I don't have all of the details and the history, but I think that the issuance been obviously such a critical part of that process that they need to be the ones saying yes or no based on all of the information that we've gotten, the clearance. Okay, are we actually granting you access or not?
Yeah, that would be my understanding too. It's tying it to access control, validating that the person is, you know, a new Tim Hortons worker and all the paperwork is signed off correctly. And yes, we do want to spend the time and money processing your application. And then from there, managing the process between Transport Canada and then granting you the RAIC. And I mean, it's a big responsibility. It's access to the sterile area, restricted areas of airports. It's a significant right to possess. So airports want to have as much control over that as possible.
Just a quick follow-up. From the pilot's perspective, I understand we're a very small amount of the employees that actually go through NPS screening through that. However, when we do go to other airports, we don't have the access control at those certain airports. Mm-hmm. However, there is a national database. Is there any way that, without creating too many levels of bureaucracy and convolution in the RAIC process, of administering that on a national level for pilots? Thanks.
I don't think airports would want to give up their access control functions, frankly, just because you have a RAIC. That's the RAIC at the airport that granted it to you, and I don't think another airport would want to take the responsibility for somebody else.
Thank you all very much for coming today and participating in this panel on crew screening. Thanks everybody, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great day.